Hi, everyone. I'm really excited to be here. I'm just going to say a few words about our group and about the software we're going to show you, and then we'll dive in. So my name is Moon Duchin, as you heard. I'm the head of a lab at Tufts. I'm a mathematician by background, so I'm a math professor. And for the last 4+ years, I've been obsessively interested in redistricting first, and then it broadened into a wider ambit on voting rights, civil rights. And so right now we run this lab together. There are 12 of us in the lab right now at the Tisch College of Civic Life at Tufts. And we have a big and fabulous network of students who have gone through some of our training programs and work with us on research projects. And I can see there's a few of our students on this call. And so that's great. Thanks for joining. And in particular, Tasia Gladkova, say hi, Tasia, who's from Virginia. She's going to let me use her as a guinea pig for some community mapping after we do our general presentation. Just to situate a little bit some of the work that we do. So we have a lot of research papers out on methods for building districts, randomized algorithms for building lots of districting plans. And that's featured in some litigation in the last cycle. In particular, over the course of the court case, League of Women Voters versus Pennsylvania, that happened in 2018, I consulted for Governor Tom Wolf on his team that was looking for an analytical framework to figure out what is a weird map and what is a normal map, to sort of help him kind of understand how to evaluate the maps that crossed his desk. So that's a lot of the work that we do, is thinking about how to put redistricting plans in the context of alternatives. But we do a lot more besides that. We have a new paper about to come out on differential privacy in the census. And what you'll hear about today is Districtr, and that is totally free public mapping software that we've been building for 3 years to help people draw plans and draw their communities. So today's focus won't so much be on drawing a whole plan, like maybe all the congressional districts for an entire state, but on drawing communities. So Liz has prepared some slides to take us through an intro to how that works, and then you'll see a little bit of live demo after that. Liz.
Great. Okay, let me share my
And also do introduce yourself if you don't
mind. I will. Yeah, so I am Liz Kopecki. The pronunciation of my last name was correct. I work as a project manager at the lab. My background is in environmental planning. And I'm also the point person for a lot of our Districtr work that we do. So this, can everyone see? Okay, cool. So this is a presentation about how to map communities in our web tool Districtr that Moon mentioned. The image on the right is a screenshot from Districtr when I went in to map the community where I grew up in Illinois. So what is Districtr? It's a free public web tool for state legislatures, commissions, community organizers, and it's also a great tool for teachers and students and anyone who wants to learn more about redistricting. It's open source, which means that all of our code and data is available to the public. And it's developed by our team at Tisch College. And we're a research lab of mathematicians, data scientists, software developers, geographers, outreach specialists, and volunteers committed to a fair and open redistricting process. And our goal was to create a mapping tool to ask the community what matters. And over the past year, we've been partnering with good government organizations and civil rights groups to customize the tool and make it as user-friendly as possible.
I'll just jump in on some of these.
Oh, sure, yeah. Did you want to add anything?
Yeah, so I'll jump in on some of these slides to add a little bit. So just to say a little bit more about Districtr. So it's, when you heard Liz say that it's open source, that means there's a GitHub repo where you can go and see all the code. And it even happens sometimes that people from around the country find their way to it and contribute code to help improve it. So Districtr changes all the time. And in fact, we just launched 50 state redistricting and community capacity just in the last month. So as we'll show you it's really customizable down to the kind of local level. And if you think of a locality that could really use its own mapping module with special features that fit the circumstances on the ground, reach out to us. And we like to work with community groups to build specifically to their needs.
All right, so this is a screenshot of our Virginia page. And when you get to the page, you can choose to do one of two things. You can either draw a districting plan and follow this purple path. And so in this case, in Virginia, you could try drawing 11 congressional districts, 40 state Senate districts, or 100 districts for the House of Delegates. And you can click on one of these cards at the bottom, and it will take you to a map where you'll first start trying to draw districts with roughly equal population. And this is really a great opportunity to play with some of the criteria that people who are drawing the maps have to think about. So if you click over on the draw communities, you will see this kind of red pathway. And here you can map your community. For the purposes of redistricting, communities and communities of interest have a legal definition, which we'll dig into specifically for Virginia in a few slides. But you can start to think about this as neighborhoods, or think larger geographies more regionally about areas like coastal communities that have unique environmental concerns.
Yeah, and I'll just say some of our interest in this is because redistricting is subject to a whole patchwork of different rules and norms around the country. Sometimes those live in state constitutions, sometimes just in common practice, sometimes in case law, right? And communities of interest is actually a named rule in more than 30 states, but there's just been a history of a lot of vagueness around the rule. So the people who draw the lines are supposed to, quote, quote, take communities into account. But what does that mean, right? And so partly one of the big motivations of this Districtr project was to be one of the groups, there are others, and we'll tell you more about some of the other options in a little bit, but to be one of the groups that's helping people make that into a tangible reality. So if you start drawing your community and then you submit that as public testimony or public input, or in a state like Virginia, now you have a commission and you can submit that to the commission for consideration, we're going to try to tell you a big picture story about how that input ends up making a difference.
Yeah, so while you can access both of the tools, this presentation is going to focus on that community piece that I'm going to be talking about. So how can...
There's a question, sorry. So Candy asks, can we draw magisterial districts within our counties? And so I want to say, yes, this is actually a big selling point. I think it's a big, unique strength of Districtr is that you can tell us your locality and how many pieces you want to divide it into. And we can build specifically to that use case. So we have done judicial districts in some parts of the country. We did a sanitation districting out in California, right? And so it's really by request that we put modules together, and we can handle all those different sizes.
Sweet. Were there any more questions, or is that?
I'll let you know.
Okay, cool. Specifically in Virginia, so with the new commission, they have to hold at least 3 public meetings in different parts of the state to collect public input. And the plan they prepare must preserve communities of interest. And we'll again get into the exact definition in the next slide, but like Moon mentioned, it's hard to map communities if you don't know exactly where they are. So we really recommend using tools like Districtr to collect public input through public mapping. And with Districtr, you can share your community boundaries, you can mark important places, and share narratives to really tell a personal story. And sharing this type of spatial data, the boundaries, and places is really important to share with the commission so they know exactly where you are.
Yeah,
this type of...
As the last bullet says there, we think this can increase the sense of public engagement and buy-in to the process. So it'll actually help your new commission succeed better if they can make good on the rule that tells them to think about communities. So there was another question in the chat. Carolyn asked, will we load the 2020 census data or does the user? So our model for Districtr is that the data passes through our lab, but if you have particular data that you want to see that comes from a public legitimate source, we're happy to post user data. Certainly our plan is, as the census updates, so at the moment it sounds like everyone's expecting new census shapes like boundaries for geographies to be released in April, and then the numbers to be released in July. That's what we're hearing. And as soon as those are released, you can expect updates on our end. But a key point to that, and Liz, you can go ahead and advance the slide, but a key point to that is you don't need to wait for the new census data to start drawing. I cannot emphasize enough how important that is. So what you see in Districtr now is boundaries from earlier. If you look at block group based modules, which we'll show you one in a moment, that's from 2010 census boundaries. But we also have modules based on precincts so that you can see where votes were cast. And I'll show you how some of that looks. But you can start drawing now, and then we'll be able to spatialize the data in a way that transfers over to the new units once they're released. So don't wait. I think that's something we're hearing as we talk to folks in a lot of states is nervousness about, especially with the census data delays, how long you have to wait to get started. And we're encouraging people to start drawing right away.
Yeah, so COIs specifically in Virginia, so defined in the code, it's a neighborhood or any geographically defined group of people living in an area with who share similar social, cultural, and economic interests. And it can't be a community based on political affiliation. But based on conversations we've had with people in Virginia, we thought a few examples of COIs could be coastal communities in Virginia Beach who rely on tourism, chicken farmers on the Eastern Shore, commuters in Loudoun County who rely on the same transportation infrastructure to DC, towns near the Blue Ridge Mountains with unique environmental concerns, and residential communities tied to the University of Virginia. If anyone can think of important COIs, I would feel free to drop them in the chat. Maybe we can try to map them.
Carolyn just did. She's asking about NORCs. I'm not sure if I know what that is. And neighborhoods. Funny you should bring up neighborhoods. We've actually been chatting with some LGBTQ organizations about the importance of trying to capture gay and gay-friendly neighborhoods. Interestingly, in some of those conversations, one of the reasons that's thought to be important, and this is a great point to keep in mind for this project, when you are able to, so when we capture all of this data, everything that's in Districtr, you don't have to log in. We don't gather any information about the user, but all the maps that people draw in Districtr will become part of a public database. And that's a data set. For instance, we're working with a great group at Ohio State University at the Carolyn Institute for the Study of Race and Ethnicity. And when we enlisted them for help in our Ohio mapping project, they said, they started rubbing their hands together and said, will we get to use the data? So this is gonna produce a big, vibrant data set that's gonna be useful not only for congressional and legislative districts, but at the city council level in the future and down the road. So it's really to, the public interest to get as many people as possible thinking about what kind of shared properties and shared interests might need a voice in government. One of our LGBTQ liaisons to some of the larger interest groups, he was pointing out that districts built around traditionally gay neighborhoods have been a really important vehicle for getting queer folk into office, first at a very local level, and then working their way kind of up a pipeline to state and sometimes to national office. So I think if there's one overriding message in the way that we're thinking about COIs, it's like Liz said on an earlier slide, think personal, think local, and a lot of times that can percolate up to something that's really importantly legible at the state level. So NORC stands for naturally occurring retirement communities. Absolutely, that's just the kind of thing that's kind of represents a shared community interest that's important for the line drawers to keep in mind. Okay, a couple more questions in the chat before we go on, although Liz, you can go to the next slide. So Fran's asking, what's the lead time? So we can typically, until things are going to start to get crazy as more census data becomes available. But if you talk to us before that new census data drops, we've been able to turn around new modules as quickly as 2 days. It can be that fast, depending on your data needs. If you need information that's already in the census data, and if you have a geography that's like neatly superimposed on census boundaries, it doesn't take us very much time at all until our queue starts to get really long. So we'd love to hear from you. And actually, I should quickly put just Districtr at MGGG. There's a request form on the site, or you can just write to us at Districtr at MGGG and let us know kind of how we can help your group. Carolyn also says Yale's Climate Central maps coastal communities by height above sea level. Yeah, absolutely. We've had some interesting requests for different kinds of data viz within the module. So for instance, a group we were working with in North Carolina wanted to see where businesses have pulled air pollution permits, right? Because they were interested in an environmental justice project. So we're really open-minded about the kinds of data that might be relevant that you might want to see while mapping with certain kinds of communities in mind. Liz?
Okay, so yeah, one of the things that we're really excited about is the goal of collecting as many unique maps from as many people across the state as possible. That's not only to hear from different communities across the state, but to learn more about how different people think about the same communities. The map, the image on the right is not from Districtr. It's actually an image from Bostonography. But this project asked people to draw the different neighborhoods of Boston. And the dark blue areas show areas where there's a lot of consensus on where the neighborhood is. And I really like this image because it kind of shows the different perspectives on each place. But by kind of collecting COIs, you can help amplify different voices in the community, regardless of the size of the community. Like this is, I guess, referencing a point that Moon made earlier. Even if the community that you map is relatively small, compared to the scale of a congressional district, that map is still really valuable because it can be used in other districted elections.
Yeah, one of the things that's so great about this map that you're looking at is it gives you a really terrific sense of how fuzzy edged of a concept community is. I mean, sometimes we forget that because there are, real estate definitions of communities that are fairly precise. Like if you look in the picture, South Boston, I don't know if those of you know Boston, South Boston or Southie is a really important historical neighborhood that has some glorious and some less glorious things in common. If you look on a map put out by the city, it'll have some clear edges. If you look on a real estate map, it'll have some clear edges. But if you ask folks, draw Southie, where is South Boston, you'll get somewhat varying answers. And so part of our story as a lab and what we do with all the input that we'll be collecting is we'll be kind of summarizing it into heat map form a little bit like this, where we can find out not only what are the locations that people ascribe to certain names, but also joined to that, what are the narrative keywords that people say about what's important to know about that part of the world. So that's where the kind of data science techniques come in at the back end to add a lot of value to what we hope will be a fantastic public collection process.
The slide is stalling, just one sec. Okay, so here's a few examples of Districtr being used in the community. The first example is the city of Napa, California. They actually linked to Districtr on their website when they were transitioning to districted elections. And so anecdotally, we heard stories about people painting their districts in Districtr, printing, signing and submitting their map as public comment. And you want to talk about Lowell?
Sure, but just to say about Napa, so that was kind of like a homegrown use of Districtr that wasn't sort of coordinated with us. What we have been refining and making easier over the time in the last year is you don't have to print it out, sign it, and put it in the mail, right? We've been figuring out how users from all around the country can make maps, tag the maps, and then submit them electronically, share them on social media, or have kind of easier ways to share their Districtr mapping. Yeah, and I'll talk a little bit about the Lowell Mass project. That was really interesting. So Lowell's a community just up the road, about 45 minutes north of Tufts. And the city was sued under the Voting Rights Act by a coalition of Latino and Asian residents who had been nearly excluded from city council representation, despite making up 40% of the city. And part of what folks had to say over the course of that lawsuit was that some neighborhoods had never had representation in the city council, while another neighborhood called Belvedere, which you see in these pictures, represented as much as 6 or 7 out of 9, I can't remember the exact numbers, but had a super majority. This tiny neighborhood had a super majority of city council control. So for us, we took a look at a real estate map of Belvedere. We took a look at an official city map of Belvedere, but then we also went to community meetings and did calls with community organizers and asked them to map Belvedere. And actually what you see is pretty interesting. The Belvedere, the sort of vernacular Belvedere, people's sense of Belvedere, didn't map very well at all onto the real estate definition, right? So we learned something more about what people had in mind when they talked about its importance from talking to them about where it is and about what characterizes it. Yeah, we can go ahead.
Sorry, it's stalling again.
Yeah, here's a really interesting example. So this is from Chicago, which is a city I lived in for years. We have a collaborator named Robert Vargas, who's a sociologist at the University of Chicago. And he has a really interesting example over here that he's used in, these are shots from Robert's book, which is called Wounded City. So Chicago's got a 50-member city council, and historically those 50 seats, they're elected from 50 different districts, so 1 member from each district. And every 10 years, the district lines are redrawn. But Robert's observation is that the way those lines cut up the neighborhoods of the city is uneven. Some parts of the city, like Bridgeport, if anyone knows Chicago, where the Daley dynasty was located, those had been held intact in districting plans and had kind of stable representation over the years. While other neighborhoods like Little Village, which is a heavily Latino community, kind of over on the west side of the city, Little Village wasn't just cut up wildly. You can see here how the ward lines cut through the neighborhood, but in fact, every time the city redid its lines, it was cut in a new way. And that created a lot of political instability. But Little Village had some needs that the residents really wanted to communicate to their aldermen. Particularly, it was gang territory for multiple gangs and had a pretty serious violence problem, such that advocates in the neighborhood were asking the aldermen for resources. They wanted more cameras in the streets to catch kind of street violence. But they had a very hard time because they would have only a small slice of the aldermen's community represented by Little Village, and changing every 10 years. So this was a prime example for us that we use as a motivating example of how the COI point of view can really reframe your thinking. In this case, the thinking wouldn't be, how many Latino seats should we create? And does this subtract from the Black seats or the white seats? Instead, it would be, what is the territory that has a shared identity and what are its needs? And how can the people drawing the lines hold that community intact so that it has a voice? I hope you see how that's a really potentially groundbreaking reframing of the districting problem.
Cool. I'll stop my share. That's the end of the slides that we prepared. But I think we're going to move into a demonstration of actually mapping a community in Virginia.
Absolutely. I see Carolyn's been throwing lots of great feedback into the chat, but I would also ask if anyone else has questions at this time before we do our little demo. Okay, so looking through Carolyn's questions, what about natural barriers? That's a question. So natural geography, physical geography is definitely also another traditional principle for line drawing bodies to keep in mind. It's not always overlapping with kind of community narratives, but sometimes it is. Sometimes what a community has in common will be very much governed by a natural environment. For instance, a group that shares a source of water, right? And that'll be an interest that's shared for the group to keep in mind. Candy asks, is Districtr being used by the Virginia General Assembly in 2021? We're hoping to get Districtr used kind of both in bottom up and top down ways around the country. So we're actually on the lookout for RFPs, requests for proposals, to work with commissions and subcommittees and other, legislative subcommittees and other redistricting bodies who are interested in making their public mapping more robust. And we'll be on the lookout in Virginia where there haven't been RFPs of that kind yet. But we don't have to wait for that. We can do bottom up mapping at the same time. And that's why we're here talking to you, because we know that the League's got a fantastic reach into the communities across Virginia. And we're hoping to tell you about Districtr, get you excited about it, and have you draw maps, tell your friends, get your friends to draw maps, talk to folks from other organizations, and have the kind of community mapping multiply in a bottom-up way. Ha says, is there a possibility of adding different languages? Yes, thank you so much for asking that. So when we did our work in Lowell, there are 3 languages that are really important in Lowell, which are Spanish, Portuguese, and Khmer, Cambodian Khmer. And so all of the materials that we distributed in Lowell were translated into those languages. So one of our big projects in the coming months is multiple language support for Districtr, so that the user will be able to view the map in different languages. This, for the map itself, is made easier because, as I'll show you in a moment, our tile set is provided by a service called Mapbox. It's a very, Google-like interface that has multiple language support. So the hard part for us will be taking all of our prompts and translating those effectively into multiple languages. And we've already been in conversation with different community organizations in Virginia who are letting us know what the important languages are for Virginia in particular. Okay, sorry, just to distinguish, let me be clear. There's 2 pieces here, because I see people are asking about the official software that's being selected. So typically, there are a few kinds of commercial software. Caliper makes Maptitude for redistricting. Citygate is another example. And there are several more whose names are going to elude me right now. Esri, of course, has a redistricting option. And very frequently, the actual map making consultant who has to draw the official legal plan will use one of those commercial software suites. So what I'm talking about is the public mapping piece, which, as far as I know, isn't yet committed. Wait, is Citygate being used to draw communities of interest? I would be quite surprised. But if so, I mentioned earlier, there are a lot of other public software options too. So I mentioned some of the commercial ones. On the public side, things you may have heard of are Dave's redistricting app, District Builder, which is based out of Philadelphia, and Representable, which is based out of the Princeton Gerrymandering Project. And something that I want to emphasize is that there's actually no need to pick just one of these software options. And what we're telling folks in a lot of these states is, now that it's so easy to find software that lets you draw, the redistricting body is going to be, we hope, in the best case, bombarded with maps that are drawn from all these different platforms. So what's actually important is that you be able to take output across multiple platforms and make it interoperable and see it all together, lay it all together so that you can synthesize it into a kind of overall consensus product. Right, okay, so I think Citygate is being used by the commission to draw the districting plan. So that's a separate question from how public input is going to be managed. Okay, one more question and then we'll switch over to the live demo. So Jennifer asks, can the COIs drawn be uploaded to other software? Oh, perfect timing. So yeah, I'll show you how this works in Districtr. And I'm sure all the other software options have also thought about interoperability. Carolyn's question, the last one is an apt one. Okay. So here's the Districtr front page. And let's scroll down and let's take a look at Virginia. And then, as Liz told you before, you have an option of whether to draw districts or draw communities. Let's pick a community. And then Tasia, are you there?
Yes, hello.
Okay, great, hi. So I'm gonna ask Tasia, I'm gonna go into the block group option. Here are the options of block groups and precincts. Those depend on whether I want to use census geography or electoral geography. So based on what kind of data I want to see, I might pick one of those or the other. So I'm going to draw with census geography or block groups. And let me do a little quick demo of how I might collect a community from Tasia. So Tasia, let's start with where you live. So tell me your address and I'll get us started.
I live at 9808 Laurel Street in Fairfax.
Okay, the first 9808 Laurel. So this is a feature is we have this search box where you can enter an address and it takes you right into a locality that you could get started in. And if you give it a little bit of time, you'll see that this map looks really similar to kind of maps on your smartphone across multiple platforms. And let's name your community while we work, Tasia. So if you were to think about where you live, and you might have multiple different communities that you identify with, but let's start with one. Is there a name of a neighborhood or a group of people with a shared interest that you could narrate for me?
I think I live pretty close to like the city of Fairfax, and I think people who live around that area like to refer to it as Old Town Fairfax.
Old Town Fairfax, okay. And is it spelled like this?
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay, great. And tell me a little bit about Old Town Fairfax. So what are some, and we'll map it out in a moment, but let's get started thinking about what are some properties that folks in Old Town Fairfax might share and would necessitate a voice in government?
Yeah, so I think one of the big concerns is education and schooling. I think that's why a lot of people move there in the first place. And also the area that it covers has both residential houses and also businesses and also public buildings like the library and town hall and things like that.
Okay. And let's start to draw it. So here I'm going to go to the paintbrush icon. I'm going to go down to the smallest size and we can start drawing. So I take it, it includes this block group that you live in. And you mentioned that it goes towards downtown. So should I start drawing this way?
Yeah.
Okay.
And keep going. And then like everything that bold Fairfax touches, like
Okay.
surrounding that word.
How's that look?
Maybe also that top one that looks, if you go, yeah, where it says Fairview, I'd include that too.
Okay, great. Here's a funny shaped one, but we'll leave that out, yeah?
Yeah, I think that goes a little bit too far away.
Okay, great. All right, and then I see we're just up against George Mason. Should we include some of the campus or have we gone far enough?
I think that the campus is kind of a different feel, so probably not include that.
Okay, great. So that's this first community. Now let's build a second one. And I think I saw in chat just before I started my screen share, the question, can't communities overlap? And just so you know, this was a design principle also in Districtr. As I go to add a second community to my map, nothing stops me from having that second community cover some of the same terrain. So communities can overlap in Districtr. All right, so how do you pronounce this? Is that Mantua?
Mantua, yeah.
Mantua, okay. So how about if we tried to draw another community in this direction? Would Mantua be a good name for it?
Yeah, we can use Mantua.
Okay. And so how far should I go?
So yeah, that one, and then the two below it, I would include those, and then maybe if there's one above it or two, I can't really tell. Yeah, that one. I think that pretty much covers most of it, but it could also go down towards Rutherford.
Okay.
I might include those two, and the one to the left, so it touches Fairfax.
Okay. Sounds good. So
Yeah.
tell me a little bit about Mantua.
So I think this is mostly like suburban houses. A lot of families live here. Like, yeah, that's I think that's a good description. I think that most of the families that live here, the parents commute to DC.
And maybe by public transit, or would it be more of a car community?
I think the way that most people do it is there's either car or there's the metro nearby. So people like carpool or something to the metro and then take the metro.
Great. And can you think of anything else that folks who live here might have in common, or that might crop up as a shared interest? If there were a community meeting here, what might it be about?
So I think the education thing applies to Mantua as well because it's the family. So I think anything related to education would be important here. Yeah, I think from what I understand, there's a large like Asian population. I know Korean is an important like language.
Great. Okay, and now let's just very quickly put down one or two points of interest. So I want to show this off as another feature. Besides being able to paint regions and talk about what they have in common, Districtr also lets you put down landmarks or important places. So can you think of, let's just do a quick example for that Korean sub-community that you were talking about. Is there a particular place that you could think of as a important commercial place or a place of congregation? Any place come to mind?
Yeah, I think there's multiple ones all around, but I think an important one that I know of is H Mart, which is like an Asian grocery store chain.
Yeah, we have one up here too.
So maybe I'd say that.
Let's look for an H Mart. Here's one in Fairfax. Does that seem like about where it is?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So I can put this down and let me find it. Oh, I can put down a mark here. I can call it H Mart and then say this is a Asian grocery store. Important. Okay, and now that's saved automatically.
Oh, I saw. Yeah, sorry, I saw in the chat someone said the flooding around the two streams in Mantua. I definitely agree with that. It's like it goes down really low and it floods a lot.
Oh, okay, great. So let's go back to our description and add that. That's a perfect example of something that a community might have as a shared interest. Okay, so that was excellent, thank you. And by the way, now that we put down H Mart as a location, anytime I mouse over that narrative description that we gave is gonna come up. So even if I zoom out, it'll still be visible as a point of interest. And so notice the landmarks, the points of interest don't have to belong to a particular painted community. They can just be anchor points for what you think of as shared interests for which you might not be able to identify the zone that they belong to necessarily. Okay, so I'll just show you a couple quick things and then stop my share and turn it back over to questions. So one thing you can do here that is pretty useful, I think, is you can take a look for the communities that we've drawn. So you now have a drop-down menu with the names that Tasia assigned for her communities. And you can flip through those and see how they compare to Virginia, to the state of Virginia as a whole. So you can see that what she called Old Town Fairfax has a pretty similar level of white population to the state as a whole, but it's significantly more Hispanic and Asian than the state. And if I flip down to Mantua, I'll never get it right. You can see, just as predicted, it has a significantly higher Asian population than the state as a whole, right? And so this gives you a way to kind of at a glance see some demographics over the communities that you painted kind of in real time. If I wanted, I could go under data layers, and this might be helpful if we were doing something very local to the area where Tasia grew up. But if I wanted to do something much more zoomed out at a bigger scale, then it might be helpful to see county boundaries. So I can turn those on and off. And then the communities that we drew, I can turn those on and off Something else that we think is kind of interesting and that folks might want to play with is among the different racial categories that people use to self-identify on the census, sometimes it's helpful to think coalitionally, like in the Lowell example that I gave, where Latino and Asian communities teamed up as plaintiffs. So you might want to see Latino and Asian together. And if I do that, this is telling me that that's now 13.3% of the state, which is pretty significant. And if I turn on the population, I can now see where is that particular relative density of Latino and Asian residents around the state. Is that making sense? Any questions about how you might use that? Okay, and so we have lots and lots of different data that can be available in these modules. We tend, like I said before, to build them custom by design. So sometimes folks want to see other variables that appear in the ACS, like the median income or the rate of the proportion of school-aged children, or you can see the ACS data contains access to broadband, who has a car, all kinds of socioeconomic and demographic data. You know, the Census Bureau just provides these terrific data sets, and all of that is incorporable if desired. Okay, so now that we've drawn this, what do we do with it? So this is the last piece that I mentioned before. There's this great share button over here at the side. And if I click that, it'll give me Tassia's plan as a URL. So now I can take that. I will throw it in the chat when I have a chance. And then you all could open up Tassia's plan, see it and start editing it, transform it yourself, edit her plan, resave it, you get a new URL and send that along. So this is a way that people can collaborate across multiple computers, and you can start to build a kind of consensus plan. Here is that URL. Okay, and then quickly, I'll also show you this idea of an event code. We're pretty excited about this. And so we could put in, this call is with the League of Women Voters of Virginia, so we can put that in as our event code. And then I can say, you know, Tassia's plan. And by clicking add to event, all that does is the way the map is stored on our database, it's now tagged by what group I was trying to communicate with and who I am. So this is totally optional. You can put that information in or not. But if you're trying to do a coordinated campaign and you want to gather from the people that you reach out to, this is a way that makes it easy for us to be able to round up those plans and send them back to you. And I'll show you a super quick example of what this might look like if you collect together. So recently we have a collaborator in North Carolina named Blake Esselstyn who wanted to use Districtr for an event with students. And so we built him a public page for his event, UNCA, that's UNC Asheville, Forsyth, because it was Forsyth County. And he had his students draw, and by tagging those plans with the tag UNCA Forsyth, we were able to have an organizer view for Blake where he could see all those plans that all of his students submitted kind of at a glance. This is kind of cool. You get to see thumbnails of the plans. He can check how many districts and whether they had assigned all the units. So he could see, you know, each team's plan and sort of see how they're different from each other. And this is also something that folks have been telling us that they want to know how to do. So the last thing I'll show you before we transition to questions is just how can you make this visible in Citygate or in whatever other software is going to be used to draw the districts. So that is available to you over here when you export. So you can export plans as something called a JSON. So this is just one computer format. A CSV, that's basically like a spreadsheet that just tells you which units are assigned to which communities. And we have a new feature, but I see we haven't rolled it out into Virginia yet, where you can export to a shapefile. So those are three formats that between them, you should be able to take your plans and upload them in any other software that's out there, whether it's Princeton's or Dave's or Citygate, right? And that's part of how, you know, this is technology, I hope at its best, where all the different groups that are doing work are trying to work together and make it possible to fuse that into a common resource. Okay, so I will stop my share and turn it over to questions. Let's see. So Carolyn pointed out, like intersectionality, don't people belong to multiple communities of interest? Just so, yes. And so what you saw, you know, in Tasia's example, her communities didn't overlap, but they could. And something that we tell people when we draw with them, and that we hope when you recruit people to draw with you, we hope you'll tell them too, you don't just have to draw the community that contains your house. Like, you have some sense of the area around you and what's important. I mean, you should be able to draw with some knowledge and give some sort of narrative color to the communities around you as well. Liz, you want to go ahead and field a couple questions?
Yeah, sure. The question from Catherine, if it's related to something called CIQ. I don't think so, but it could be the familiarity of Mapbox.
Exactly. Mapbox is used by the New York Times. It's used all over the place. So that's the software that makes the tiles that we were painting can and should look familiar to you from other apps.
Cool. So there was also a question about the age of housing stock. So is that, I don't know if that's data in the census, but I know in our North Carolina community module, for example, we've taken some of the census housing data like homeownership versus renter and found a way to bring that into the module. So if it is in the census, then yes, that is something we could bring into the modules.
You know, and even if it's not in the census, there are other sources. For instance, some of our work in Minnesota's got an incredible state level GIS staff that maps all kinds of things. So something like by age of housing stock, I think you mean like how long ago the houses were built. Were they new construction or have they been around for a long time? If you can find us a good public data set, we'll map it. We're pretty flexible in terms of the format, as long as we know like that your data is coming from someplace authoritative. Let's see. Mantua is historically very Jewish. Oh yeah, that's an interesting one that won't necessarily show up in the census data. But one way to kind of plot that on a map is that maybe there are Jewish community centers or synagogues that you could point to as kind of markers for a historically Jewish neighborhood. Let's see, let's just field some other questions.
There's a question about which building blocks are used to create COIs. So the module that we showed was census blocks, and block groups, and we like to show census block groups because we can show more ACS data in those modules. But for a lot of modules that we make for local cities, we can bring in blocks because we know those finer units are sometimes better at capturing really small communities. So all that is to say, there's some flexibility in the units that we have in the different modules, and it's often on a case-by-case basis.
Yeah, when folks ask for city-specific modules, we usually build those with the tiniest pixels, which are census blocks. There are 11 million census blocks in the 2010 census data across the country. So those can be, in a city, those usually are actual city blocks. It's partly how they get their name, census blocks. If we try to use now, another important thing to remember about Districtr, it's not an app that you download and install. It's totally browser-based. So it is possible, especially on a kind of lightweight laptop, to overwhelm it if you try to give it too much information. So we tend not to use the tiniest building blocks because it'll overheat your browser if you do it at the state level. But if you want to do it for a city, then you can, you know, like for the Napa project, that would be block based because at the city level, you want to be really granular and talk about where the neighborhood extends. Right, and so to the question, which is the right units for COIs? So I mentioned before, we're not going to get the new census geography for some months. So any units that we collect in, we're going to use kind of spatial statistical techniques to transfer those over into the new units. So I've come to think it doesn't matter so much which units you draw in. You want them to be granular enough to capture the texture at the level that you want to narrate it, right? And so it's different units for different purposes. Let's see, is it possible to create a map and share it on Facebook? Yes, so this is part of why I dropped the example of Tasia's map in. We have been seeing, like, I think literally thousands of Districtr maps crop up on Twitter. So that URL that was created is short enough for a tweet. So you can absolutely share your maps on Facebook, on Twitter, or by email, or people text me their maps. That's another important point, I think. Because it's browser based, it works across hardware really nicely. So back before COVID, we spent a lot of time thinking about making sure it would work well on an iPad, because we envisioned people going door to door and actually having people finger draw their communities. That's probably going to happen a little less than we had expected, but a happy side effect of all this effort building it out is that now people can do just what we're doing now and draw together, but online. Let's see some other questions. Wouldn't the current county and city lines be important when used for redistricting? Absolutely. And that's why we have the option to see county lines. And actually, I invite you to play around with this yourself, but we also put in the option to paint a whole county at a time. So if you're really zoomed out at the level of the state and you're trying to say these two counties are alike, you could grab the whole county all at once rather than having to select every one of its pieces. City lines definitely as well. You know, Virginia, you have this fairly unique in the country, I think, system of independent cities that function like counties. And so you'll see those are visible in the county tool. But in all different states that we work in, there'll be a different best data source for municipal boundaries, and we'll try to use the best data source available. Carolyn wants to share her screen, and that's absolutely fine with me. Let me just make sure we saw a lot of these other questions before we switch to Carolyn's screen share.
The one about existing districts is interesting. That's something, so our New Mexico page might be a good example for that. In the module, we have layers where you can turn on the congressional districts, the state senate and state house districts, so you can see those while you're mapping. But if you scroll down on the state landing page, you can actually click on a map of the existing districts in Districtr, and you can actually start adjusting the districts.
I'll actually show you that quickly. So if I go back to the Virginia landing page and scroll down, there's some discussion. We tried to explain some reform efforts, describe some recent legal challenges, tell you a little bit about the rules of redistricting. And then here are some sample plans. So among those are the enacted congressional plan from the last cycle. So if I click that, it'll take me into that plan and I'll get to see something about like how that plan works under the surface. So if I give it a moment to load, incidentally, you'll notice that it doesn't have perfect population balance. And the reason is that this is drawn on precincts, but the plan itself actually splits precincts. We had to round it off to the nearest precinct. So it sort of creates a little bit more population deviation than the plan actually has. If I go to evaluation, I can see how voting age population, and here's voting age population, sorry, this is total population, and the second set is voting age population distributes over the districts. And then also because this is a state where we have some previous election results, I can look, for instance, at the 2016 presidential election and see who got more votes, Clinton or Trump, in each of these districts. All right, so it's a pretty powerful tool. Although, heads up, I don't think we made sure in every case that the numbers we assign to the districts correspond to their official numbers. So you should actually check by color to be sure that you know which district is which. That's something that we need to do as an update, is make sure we coordinate our numbering system with the actual official numbering system. Quickly, while I'm showing you that, I'll just say I can actually see those previous elections as well. So this is showing the 2018 Senate election. And then if I flip to the presidential election, I get to sort of page through these and see how the voting patterns change from one to the next. And that can be pretty interesting as a picture of change over time. Okay. Bill just asked a question that's really close to my heart about the Voting Rights Act, but maybe we can do Carolyn's screen share first and then talk about VRA. Carolyn, want to say hi? If you're talking, you might be on mute.
I wasn't talking, but
Okay.
now I am. I provided Zoom for a constituent visit to the legislator who has this mess. And that is all water.
Yep.
And that's water too. This is why I was asking about natural barriers,
Yep. So
which
this,
are a huge issue in the Norfolk area.
absolutely. Yeah. So this relates to one of the traditional principles, which is that districts should be contiguous. So every district should all be one piece and not broken into what this looks like. This looks like 3 separate pieces. So
Well, around here, apparently contiguous includes boats.
I was just about to tell you, sometimes there's a nickname for this in the biz, which is usually we like to talk about rook contiguity. It's like if you had a rook on a chessboard, how it would be able to transit around the district. Or sometimes people talk about queen contiguity. So if you're able to connect things that are diagonal to each other. What you just saw, people use the nickname duck contiguity, like a duck could swim from one part of the district to another. So yeah, I would say in our lab, we spend a lot of time thinking about all the rules and all the loopholes and all the rules. And water is actually a really tricky one because islands have to be districted. So they have to be connected to something. And there's been a lot of debate about whether you should connect an island only when there's a bridge. You know, what does it mean to be connected, contiguous? So that is one of the 10 million gray areas in the redistricting rules. So
The only connection is tolled. Does that matter?
is told, oh, that, yeah, that's interesting. You know, in the, actually in the Virginia, so, okay, I'll tell you a little bit about recent Virginia history, and maybe I'm preaching in the choir. Maybe you all know this just as well as I do, but you had a lot of litigation in the last cycle, and the same outside expert, Bernie Groffman, brought in as a special master 2 times, brought in for the congressional plan and the House plan, but not the Senate plan. Bernie's a political science professor at UC Irvine who's done a whole lot of map drawing for courts. And this is one of the things that his team was dinged on, was their the connections across water, where the connections between the communities on the other, here's where communities matter, by the way. They had to try to make the case that they were connecting groups that had something in common. And so that's where something like the existence of a bridge or a toll on the bridge might be relevant. There's a case in Alaska where the existence of a seaplane, a commercial seaplane service was relevant, right? And so it's really, this is where the community story actually rises to the level of hugely important in litigation. It helps you justify why some parts of the state are connected to others, including across water. Yeah, he's the one that drew that. I am not surprised. Yes. Great. Okay, so I wanted to go back to Bill's question, which is, how about the Voting Rights Act? Let's talk for a moment about the Voting Rights Act, what it does and doesn't say. And boy, Virginia is a great place to have the conversation, because one of those lawsuits, the Bethune Hill v. Golden suit in the last cycle, really hinged on the question of how to take the Voting Rights Act into account in the Virginia House of Delegates, right? And so what does the Voting Rights Act say? Super briefly, it says that you can't have any system or device that blocks communities of color, minority groups in the language of the act, from an opportunity to elect candidates of choice. Okay, so it doesn't guarantee some kind of proportional representation. In fact, very explicitly doesn't guarantee that. But if, for instance, there's a districting plan which dilutes the vote for communities of color, then you have a cause of action under the VRA. Okay, so how is that relevant when you try to draw? Well, here's what not to do. What not to do is what came through the Virginia legislature last time, which is a House of Delegates plan in which 12 districts had Black voting age population above 55%. And then there was a giant drop off, and the next ones were in the 30s and below. And the folks who drew that map said, well, we hit 55% so that we could be confident that they would elect Black candidates of choice. And this went all the way up to the Supreme Court, twice in fact. And the court said, no, you can't just decide that 55% Black is your target and draw to that. That's inappropriate predominance of race, right? And so the case law around the Voting Rights Act, and let me emphasize, I am a mathematician and not a lawyer, but one with an intense interest in the law, as you can probably tell from all my geekery here. The way that the case law has evolved, you need to center electoral opportunity, but without using demographic targets. So you'll notice that what's in Districtr is census data, so it lets you look at those percentages. But that's not good enough for VRA enforcement. For VRA enforcement, you have to look at electoral history, okay? And so in our modules, you will see some electoral history, you know, it's not race alone, but we're not giving you enough information because it's very difficult to do so to be sure you're drawing districts that are compliant with the VRA. I will tell you though that our lab has a brand new paper out in collaboration with a veteran of the Department of Justice called Sam Hirsch, who's a VRA attorney, about how to take the VRA into account while you draw in a really computer savvy way. And we'll be debuting a Districtr module that shows you how to do that. We're using Louisiana as our first test case. And we've prepared a module in collaboration with NAACP, LDF, for thinking about like modern ways to take the VRA into account while you draw. So if you're interested in hearing more about that, please reach out. I'll put my own contact information here in the chat. I'd love to send you this new draft paper and show you our demo module. What it does, I'll just tell you quickly, there's no secret sauce here. We just show you really rich electoral history. And under the hood, we've done a statistical inference procedure to figure out who is the candidate of choice. In Louisiana, it's for Black voters. So who is the Black candidate of choice in various recent elections? And then as you draw, you can see, was this district effective for the Black candidate of choice? I would love, you know, I'll say our paper's a little super technical, but for those of you, I mean, I know the league is great at having folks who will really dig in. I'd be thrilled to get feedback from many of you on this work. I think it's pretty exciting because the computational community and the attorneys have kind of had a certain kind of relationship over the last few decades as litigators and experts, but actually working together to collaborate on new technology and new projects is really exciting. So I'd love to put that in front of any of you and hear your thoughts. Jennifer asked, are there now better ways to do polarized voting analyses? Yeah, it seems like we have some attorneys on this call, I'm guessing. Yeah, so the techniques that have evolved over the last 50 years for racially polarized voting, it started out with linear regressions, and then a suite of techniques called ecological inference came online in the 1990s. And yes, we're hard at work on modernizing racially polarized voting techniques, especially through the use of survey data. And so that's kind of out at the cutting edge of what people are doing to measure racial polarization. So, you know, we're all buckled up for this new Supreme Court, right? And we know that the Voting Rights Act is under attack. And there's lots of really interesting work happening around the country at kind of thinking about what comes next for the future of protecting voting rights around the country. For the non-attorneys, I apologize for the perhaps overly detailed sidebar, but I love this stuff. I think it's really interesting. Yeah, and maybe that gives you a good glimpse at like our lab. We make the software, but also we do a lot of research that goes to peer-reviewed journals and kind of hopefully moves the conversation forward about best practices. Great. So I hope we talked about we addressed most of the questions that are in the chat. Oh, how can we access the software? Please Districtr.org. Go, oh, and in fact, if I put it in properly, you'll be able to just click it. Now that should be a live link. Go on in and play around. We've got all 50 states plus Puerto Rico and DC, all 52 states, I hope one day. And check it out, play around, give us feedback. If there's more data or if something's broken or if you'd like to see things done a little bit differently, all of that would be music to our ears. Maybe not the broken part, but the rest of it. One state is quite enough, yeah, indeed. All right, Deb, so should we pass it back to you to see if you have any?
Yes, thank you so much, Moon. And we will have a train the trainer session in January. There's actually 2 of those. If you go to our website, you can find it there. We'll have it in the newsletter. I can drop that into the chat bar. But thank you so much, Moon and Liz. We appreciate your expertise and look forward to working with you as we move forward into the process.
Great. And Tasia, thanks for joining us, taking a break from your finals to join us tonight and be our guinea pig.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
All right, good night, everyone.